In this tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to make this Inception spinning animation in Unreal Engine 5. I'll also be going over how to model this spinner in Blender, but if you want to skip that part, you can find the model I make in the description below. You can also find all the files I'll be using, the hdris and everything in the description. Also, if you want the project files for this scene, you can get that from my Patreon linked below, and that's also a way to support me. All right, let's get started. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to search for a reference image. So just go to Google and search for Inception Totem, and I'll be using this image. So I've downloaded this image. Also, I want an hdri, so I'll go to polyhaven.com. I'm going to go into hdris and click on indoor, and I'll use this one, Brown Photo Studio. You can download this, just change the format to HDR, and you can download it in any resolution you want. Once we have these two files, we can get started now. I will open up Blender. Once in Blender, I'll select everything and delete it. I'll add a cube and then press N and go into the transforms properties and click on this X dimension and drag it down. So anything I put here will be set to all of them. So I'll put in 0.026, and this is the scale we are working at. So go into front view, and I will bring our reference image and I'll drag this in. Once we have a reference image, I'll scale this down to match our size. There we have it. So let's get started on modeling our totem. There are many ways we can model this. We could use a cylinder or we could use a circle, but I'll be using a cube since these top parts won't have proper geometry if we use another way. So how I will model this is I'll select the cube and add a subdivision modifier at level 1 and apply this, and then I'll add a cast modifier, set the factor to 1 to make this more spherical, and I'll apply this as well. Now in edit mode, I'll select the middle edge and I'll control B to bevel it and just bevel it slightly. Now I'm going to select the bottom half of the sphere and position it at the bottom. Scale it down and position it so it aligns with the bottom. And I'll do the same with the top. Now I will add a subdivision modifier to this. And I will uncheck optimal display so I can see the effects. Now I'll just hit Ctrl R and add loop cuts and just position everything by scaling the loops and moving them around. So one loop here, one loop over here, one loop over here. Now I'll just scale these. If I'm selecting all three of them, what I can do is when I'm scaling, I can hit Shift Z and this will not scale these in the Z axis. So something like this. I'll select these top ones, move them up, select these, move them down. We just want to trace this, our reference image. So I'll select this, scale this in. I'll add another one over here. I'll actually add another one here. So we are just tracing these and making sure it matches our reference image. So I'll move this down. I'll select this entire part and scale it down a bit. So with this, we're pretty much done with the modeling. So this was an easy model to make. So in object mode, I'll right click on this and set it to shade smooth. And there we have it. So let's UV unwrap this now. So before unwrapping this model, I'm going to hide the reference image, select this and position this like this just above our X. And we can see that our model isn't very high polygon. So I'll bump up the subdivision one more level. Or you can bump this up as much as you want. Since we're going to have a close-up of this, we want this to be very high poly. So I'll put this at 4. Okay, so now let's go into edit mode. And the way I'm going to unwrap this is I'm going to select, I'm going to go into top view and I'm going to select all 4 of these. And from the back, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the entire loop, half of it at least. I'll go all the way down and I'll do the same by selecting all 4 of these. And I'm going to right click and I'm going to set this to mark scene. Okay, so we have this done. Now I'll click over here in UV editing and I'll go, I'll press A to select everything and then press U and click on unwrap. So now we have this. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to select everything and rotate this to straighten this up. Now I'm going to select any square I can see here. So I'll select these 2 vertices and I'll scale them in the y-axis and then I'll press 0. I'll do the same with these S, Y, 0. And then I'll select these 2 S, X, 0. And then also these 2 S, X, 0. Now I'm going to select this face and then press A to select everything and right click follow active quads. Now we have this. To preview this better, I'll make a new texture. I'll make this a color grid. Press OK. Now let's add this material onto our model so we can see how it affects everything. So I'll go into texture view and go into materials, create a new material, click on this dot next to base color, add a image texture, and then we can select our texture here. So this is how it looks. So in UV editing, I'll press A to select everything. I'll scale it down and basically try to fit this into our image texture here. So move this around, then scale it on the X. We just have to get close enough. So I think this is good enough and we're done with the modeling and UV unwrapping part of this tutorial. Now we want to export this model. So before I export it, I'm going to select the spinner and I'm going to go into object and I'm going to apply the scale and location. So I'll just set apply all transforms. So this is good now. Okay, so next thing I'll rename this to spinner. And now I want to export this. So with the object selected, I'll go into export and I'll export this as an FBX and find wherever you want to export this. And now what I'll do is I'll click on limited to selected objects and object types to mesh. And I'll just name this spinner. And I'll click on export. Now let's open up Unreal Engine. So I'll launch Unreal Engine. I'll go into games, blank, and I'll turn on ray tracing. You don't have to if you don't have a ray tracing graphics card. And I'll name this project and I'll hit create. Okay, let's set up our project now. So I'll go into project settings and I'll scroll down into rendering. And here I'll go down and we can see that we have support hardware ray tracing enabled because we checked ray tracing when creating our project. Next, I'll turn on use hardware ray tracing when available. And that's about it. And now let's go into our plugins and I'll search for hdri. I'll enable this and I'll also enable movie render queue. There we have it, and I'll click on restart. So now let's import all of our files. We'll go into our content drawer and I'll create a new folder. I'll call this assets. Go inside this, I'll create a folder called models and another one called hdri. And in our hdri, what we want is we want to bring in the hdri we downloaded. So make sure it's in .hdr format and I'll drag this in. And next I'll go into our models and I'll find the model we exported. Here it is, and I'll drag this in. I'll click on reset to defaults. So one thing we want to do is we want to increase the import scale because we made this model so small in Blender. If we don't increase the scale, it will have artifacts. I'll just show you that right now. So if we open up we bring our model in, you can see if we increase the scale, you can see that there's parts missing from the top and the bottom. So I'll delete this. I'll delete all of this and I'll bring this in again and I'll increase the import scale to 10 and then I'll hit import. Now if we look at our model, we can see everything's working fine. We have the entire model intact without any issues. Now I'll create a new level. I'll create an empty level. And over here, what I want to do is I want to bring in an hdri. So I'll click on this and search for hdri and click on hdri backdrop. Now we have this hdri backdrop in. I'll go into our content drawer and drag our own hdri into this cube map. And we have set up our hdri in this new level. So we want to change a few things in our hdri. The first thing we want to change is the size, because if I bring in our model, let me reset the position and I'll move this hdri down a bit. You can see our model is black. We don't get any lighting on it. So I'll bring in a plane as well. You can see the lighting is very bad. So the first thing I'm going to do is in our hdri, I'm going to add 2 zeros. I'll make this 15,000 and now you can see we have lighting. Also, I'll change the projection center to 30,000 and I'll reset the position and I'll move this to minus 30,000 in the Z axis. And also I'll change the intensity to 0.5 and now we can start working on our lighting and set up our materials and our camera. Just make sure you save everything, so you can go into file and save all, and it will ask you to save your level. So in assets, I'll create a new folder called maps and I'll just name this map 01 and click on enter And there we have it. Just make sure you keep saving your file once in a while. Let's set up our post-process volume now. So I'll go and bring in a post-process volume. And first thing I'm going to do is scroll all the way down and enable infinite extent. And now we want to set our exposure. So in exposure, I'll change our metering mode to manual, and I'll uncheck apply physical camera exposure, and I'll set this to minus 1.76. And now we can go down and you can either change your lumen settings now, or you can change them right before you are rendering your animation. So I'll just bump this up, and also in the reflections I'll change the mode to hit lighting for reflections. Okay, so now let's start setting up our lighting and materials. So I'm going to set the scale for our spinner. I'm going to make this smaller. I'll set this to 0.2. We don't want to go very small. If we go to the accurate scales, Lumen isn't very good at lighting very small objects. So we'll make this slightly bigger. And now what I'll do is I'll set up our camera. So I'll go into cinematics and bring in a cinematic camera actor. And I'll change the film back to DSLR. Also, I'll change the focal length to 80. And for now, I'll increase the aperture so I can see what I'm doing. Now, I'll right click on the camera and select pilot. And now I can set up the position for the camera. So I'll set it up something. I'll go into perspective, into cinematic view, and pilot our camera again. If it isn't piloting, you can go down into perspective and select your camera over here. And now what I can do is I can enable these grids. If you scroll down while moving your camera, you can change the speed at which it moves. So I'll make this slower, and I'll position this somewhere like this, maybe looking down a bit. For now, I'll position this somewhere around here. So now I'll go back into the default view. And what we can do is, while we're working, if we go down over here into layouts, we can split this, and over here change this one to perspective and pilot the camera. And now we will always have this view of our camera over here. A good position I found for the camera is if we set it manually, we can set the X to minus 18 and the Y to 38 and the Z to 11. We can set our rotation on the y-axis to minus 13.4, and we can set our z rotation to minus 69. So I think this positioning is a lot better. Now I'll change the focus setting. I'll click on draw debug focus plane, and I'll position this around here. You can just click and drag inside of here to move this. So we want this to be touching right under the totem. Also, I'll change the aperture to 7.7, and I'll uncheck draw debug focus plane. Let's bring in some materials for our spinner and for the table that this spinner is on. So I'll go into Quixel Bridge, and I'll go into surfaces. We want a metal for our spinner. So in metals, I'll go into gunmetal, and the one I'm using is this one, the brushed aluminum. So what you want to do is you can select the quality here. I selected high quality, and you can click on download. Once you have this downloaded, you can click on add, and if we go back in our project, you can see in our content draw we have this material over here. So let's also get the material we want for our table. So I'll go into wood, and I'll go to veneer, and the one I'm using is this one, walnut veneer. Do the same thing. You can download this on whichever quality you want and then add this to your project. So let's find our material. I'll go into our content draw and I'll drag this onto our spinner, and also I'll drag this wood material onto our plane. If it's not updating, you can check this real time off and then it should update. Also, if you click G, if you press G on the keyboard, you can hide the gizmos. So one thing we want to do is we want to rotate this 90 degrees. Also, let's adjust these materials a bit. So I'll open up the metal material and I'll change the tiling. I'll go into tiling and I'll set this to 0.2 and 0.2. Also, I'll go into the normal map and I'll increase the strength to 5, and I'll click on save. Now let's adjust our wood material. So I'll open up our wood material. I'll change the tiling to 0.7, and also I'll go into albedo and I'll change the saturation a bit. I'll make this around something like this, 1.4, and I'll increase the brightness to like this, and I'll change the contrast as well. Also in normal, I'm going to increase the normal strength to 10. You can see how it makes it look like it's on a smaller scale, since we can see more of the details. You can see how it's affecting the material. Now let's add a light so we aren't only relying on the hdri. So I'll add a rect light, bring this in, and I'll right click on this and pilot this, and let's position this somewhere nice. Also, I'll turn on ray trace shadows. Now let's position this. We want to see how we can see the highlights. This is too bright, so let's set the intensity to 4. And now we can position this. If you move this over here, you can see how it's changing the look. So we want this to match our light in the window somewhat. If we move this up and down, you can also see the effects of that. So I'll position this something like this. You can copy the location and rotation if you want, or you can just position this however you want yourself. So let's get out of here. And now let's set up the background a little bit. Let's add a few objects in here. So we want some vases we can put over here. So let's go into bridge and search for vase. So the one I'm using is this one, the wooden vase. You can download this like you did the textures and materials and add this to your project. Also, we want to change the material to a marble material. So let's search for crema, and I'm using the first one we have over here. So add this to your project as well. And now we can go back to our project. So let's bring in our vase. If we go into our 3D assets, we can drag this in. Let's scale this up and position this. You can see that it's very low poly. It doesn't look very good. So what we can do is we can go into our modeling tools and we can go into our model tab and subdivide it right here inside of Unreal Engine. And I'll leave the subdivision levels to 3, and then I can just click on accept. So there we have it. We subdivided it. Now we can go back and let's position this. I will uncheck our snapping tools for moving, and what I will do is I'll move this somewhere around here like this. You can see over here how it's framed. Maybe bring this a bit closer. Also, I'll duplicate this by holding down Alt and moving this, and I'll change the scale of this one to 3 and move this down as well. If you hit end on your keyboard, it will automatically snap to the table. So let's position this something like this. Okay, so now let's change this to a marble. So we can go into our marble material and we can just drag this onto here. Okay, that looks great. So now we can start with animating our scene. Before that, I'll save everything. So let's create our sequence. So I'll go into assets and create a new folder. I'll name this SEQ. Come in here, right click and go into cinematics level sequence. And I'll name this SEQ01 and I'll open this up. And now what I want to do is I want to drag in our camera from here, and we want to drag in our spinner as well. I want this to be a 10-second animation. You can set it to whatever you want. Also, I want this at 24 frames per second. That's more cinematic look, a more film look. So I'll set this to 24 frames per second. Also, I'll go here and set show time as to seconds so we can see how many seconds there are. And if I drag this up, we can extend our timeline. So I'll set this to 15 and I'll drag this up so we can see 10 seconds. I want to drag this red bar, this is our end time, and move it to 10 seconds. And also I want to extend this all the way to 10 seconds. Now what I want to do is I want to select our spinner, and in our rotation at our 0 frames we want to set a keyframe, and at 10 seconds I want to change this to 18,000 and set another rotation keyframe. You can either click on this button here or you can click here, and now our spinner should spin. Well, it's not spinning, so I guess it didn't set that. So change this again. Now it's spinning. You can see the spinner is spinning. Now let's add in a little bit of a wobble. So you can either add this at the end if you just want this to slowly start wobbling, or since I'm creating a looping animation, I want the starting position and the ending position to be the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it slowly wobble, and then by the end it's going to stabilize again. So around here at 8 seconds, what you can do is if we remove the snapping for our rotation and I slightly rotate this on the y-axis, just slightly, like 2 degrees, and then I set a keyframe. Now what this is going to do is, if we play this, you can see that it slowly starts to wobble, and then it stabilizes again. So that's what we want. Also, what I'm going to do is I want this to be spinning before the animation starts, so it doesn't start up as we're spinning. And the spinning isn't correct since it's ramping up and ramping down. So what I will do is I will select all of these and I will right click and I will make them linear. So what that makes it makes it spin at a constant rate. Also, I'm going to extend this backwards. I'll set this to -15. And here at -10 seconds, I'll set the rotation to -18,000 and I'll set a keyframe. So what that allows is when the animation starts, it's 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 already spinning. So you can see it's already spinning from before. You move this behind 0, it's still spinning. So now let's render this out. So if we click on this, the movie render queue will open. What you want to do is you want to click on this unsaved config to change the settings. And let's add in a few modules. Let's add in the game overrides. What this does, it forces your engine scalability settings to be set to cinematic. Also, let's add in anti-aliasing. So this is the most important module for this render, since this spinner is rotating and it has motion blur. It won't look good if you don't have anti-aliasing in it. So let's set the temporal sample counts to something like 16 or 32 or 64. The more samples you have, the longer it will take to render. So just be careful with that. You can set this to 16 if you want it to render quickly. I'm going to set this to 64 and also click on override anti-aliasing and leave the method to none. Now, if we go into output, you can change the resolution here. I'm going to leave it at 1080p and just click on accept and render local. That should start up the rendering. Now that the rendering is complete, if you browse to the project files directory and go into saved and in movie renders, you can see out the rendered sequence. But if you want to convert this into a video file, what we can do is we can open up Blender and over here click on video editing. Now we want to set up our settings. First, set up the correct resolution, what you rendered at. Also select the right frame rate and select the frame range. We rendered out 240 frames, so I'll set that to the end frame. And now over here, if I copy this location, if I hit Control A or Shift A and go into image sequence, and now if I click on the first one and hit A on the keyboard, I can add image strip, and now we have this in our Blender file. So to export this, you can set an export directory over here. Wherever you want, you can select wherever you want to save this. Also in encoding, you can go in and you can set this to no audio if there isn't any audio here. And you can set the output quality. So the lower the quality, the lower the file size. And I'm going to set this to perceptually lossless. And then you can just hit render animation. And with this done, you'll have your final rendered video. If this tutorial was useful to you, please consider liking the video. Also, if you want to watch more content like this, you can subscribe to my channel. And if you want the project files for this tutorial or you just want to support me, you can check out my Patreon linked below. If you are interested in learning how to light scenes in Unreal Engines like products and interiors, you can check out the course linked below as well.